No, we're on symbiosis. So we're going to skip a few slides. They're just sort of review about food webs, food chains, energy pyramids. I think those are simple enough that you guys don't need to do as much practices as in here. All right, our next topic that we want to get to is about the interactions between species in an ecosystem. So there's lots of ways that two different species can interact. Sometimes one is a predator and one is a prey. Sometimes one's an herbivore, one's a producer. But there are some other special categories of these species interactions that we give special names as well. We call these different forms of symbiotic relationships, symbiosis. And this is when two species have a close relationship. Often it's when one lives in or on another, or interacts very closely with it. Like those fish on sharks? Yeah, we'll talk about a bunch of examples. And so the three types of symbiotic relationships we'll mention are parasitism, mutualism, and commensalism. So the one you're probably familiar with is parasitism. What is a parasite? How can we define a parasite? David?
Something that feeds off of blood of other animals.
Okay. It's not always blood, but you're kind of getting on the right track.
It kind of like sticks with the animal, like if you have like dead skin or just like use it.
Yeah, something that lives sort of closely in or on the other organism. And in parasitism, because for all of these types of symbiotic relationships, we talk about how each organism is affected. So in a parasitic relationship between the two organisms, one organism is gaining something. And what about the other?
It's getting a disease.
The parasite is getting...
It's being injured or harmed in some way. Okay? So the organism that is being harmed or injured, we call it the host. And then the organism that's benefiting from this relationship, gaining something, is the parasite. So what would be an example? Let me ask an example of a parasite.
Fleas.
Fleas?
Ticks.
Yeah. Leech?
Leech.
Leech?
Well, didn't we learn that leeches don't really harm you that much? They just kind of...
Yeah, they don't do a ton of harm. Like I think leeches attach and stay attached, which they don't. But they are, I guess, somewhat parasitic.
Worms?
Yeah, some types of flatworms, tapeworms, okay, heartworm. Those are good examples of parasites. So a tapeworm, as an example, gets into a person or an animal's digestive tract, attaches there, and as that animal eats, the tapeworm absorbs the nutrients. So the tapeworm gets a nice place to live that's protected, gets a constant source of food, so it's benefiting. However, its effects on its host are that they become ill, they're being robbed of nutrients, those worms can clog up the digestive tract, so the host is actually being harmed.
So with the tapeworm, wouldn't that make like an animal skin?
Yeah, sometimes. Like if you see animals that are really affected by a significant number of parasitic intestinal worms, they'll be very thin. I'll show you a picture of that.
How do you get out?
What's that?
How do you get out with this?
Usually, like if it's your dog or something, you just take one pill. Like my dogs that had, we had to deworm our puppy when we got her because she hadn't been. Almost all dogs are infected with worms in their first few weeks after birth.
What?
And so usually before you get, if you go and you get a dog from a breeder or somewhere, they'll give it deworming medication before you ever get it. Okay, 4 or 5 weeks old. We got our dog early for some reason, and it hadn't been given the deworming medicine, so we had to give it to her, and we did, and then it was absolutely disgusting. Like after we gave her the medication for the next 24 hours, whenever she went to the bathroom, it looked like a plate of spaghetti because all of these worms. The medicine kills the worms, and then the dog gets rid of them through defecation. So yeah, it's kind of gross.
Oh, that's nasty.
Yeah. Fleas on a dog, another example of a parasitic relationship. So there's our other relationships as well that people often aren't aware of. What do you think mutualism might be. How are the two organisms affected, Dora?
It's a mutual relationship, like they both get something out of it.
Yeah, they're both benefiting out of the relationship. Okay. I'll show you an example here. This is, well, a bee pollinating flowers, right? The bee benefits because it gains nectar, and the flower benefits because the bee pollinates it.
What's the context?
This is the Nile crocodile and the Egyptian plover. The Nile crocodile is a like ferocious predator, kills people sometimes. And this is the Egyptian plover. And this Nile crocodile actually will open up its mouth and allow the plover to actually walk in its mouth, peck around in there, and walk right out, and it never harms it. And it's because they have evolved to have this mutualistic relationship. What do you think the Egyptian plover bird gains out of this relationship? Yeah?
It gets food because it eats the food out of it.
Yeah, pecks around the crocodile's teeth and gets little bits of food that are stuck in there. So the plover benefits, but also the crocodile
Getting clean.
gets clean teeth. And so they're less likely to decay, okay, and less likely to get infected, and so it benefits as well. So they have this mutualistic relationship.
Isn't there like a spider that takes a frog as a pet?
I don't know, I'm not fair. There's lots and lots of examples of these. I don't know about all of them. You know, clownfish and a sea anemone? The sea anemone has stinging tentacles with nematocysts. However, the clownfish is not affected by them. And the clownfish lives within the tentacles.
It protects them, right, from other fish.
Yeah, so the clownfish is protected from other predators because predators will avoid sea anemones because they don't want to get stung. So the clownfish is protected. But the sea anemone also benefits because as the clownfish brings in its food and eats, little bits of that food are used by the anemone as its food source. So again, it's providing protection, but it's getting food. So they're both benefiting.
I love that word.
Now the last type is this relation called commensalism. This is when one of the species is benefiting and the other is not really affected at all. It's not helped, it doesn't benefit, but it's also not harmed in any way. For example, a barnacle. Barnacles are sea creatures. They are filter feeders. They attach to a surface and sort of stick there. Well, sometimes they attach to turtles or whales and basically can hitch a ride. As they hitch a ride through the water, they're filtering out bits of food and so forth. So they're getting a benefit from it, but it doesn't harm the turtle or the whale in any way. It doesn't affect them. Or a robin building a nest in a tree would be an example of commensalism. The robin gets a nest, a place to lay its eggs and so forth. It doesn't hurt the tree in any way. It doesn't help the tree in any way. So that's commensalism. So here's some pictures. So we talked about these fish, right?
Yeah.
Those are lamprey. Okay, lamprey, those jawless fish, which are parasites of large fish. This little shrimp and this goby fish live together in burrows under the water. The shrimp cannot see, it's basically blind, and they live in these tunnels together. And so the shrimp, when it comes out of the tunnel, it helps to dig out the tunnel and clean it up. So the shrimp, when it comes out of the tunnel, the goby goes with it, keeps an eye out for predators, and the shrimp keeps its antenna in contact with the fish. So when the fish bats into the burrow because a predator is coming, the shrimp goes along with it. So it kind of warns it for any other predator. Here's a barnacle on a sea turtle, you see. Again, these barnacles are not hurting the sea turtle. They're being helped because they're getting a ride through the water. So that's commensalism. Here, and Talia mentioned this, I think somebody. This is a polar bear affected by tapeworm. You see how skinny it is.
Oh, it looked like it was turned around there.
It's not tropical, it's just not snowy area. Yeah. So again, even no matter how much food this polar bear eats, it's probably not going to be able to survive much longer because all the nutrients are being sort of absorbed by this parasite. Some hermit crabs will actually pick up sea anemones and put them on their shell and walk around with a sea anemone attached to the top of them. and they are protected by it. Lots of birds will live in close proximity to mammals and sort of stay on the backs of herbivores like this, and sometimes they pick little bits of food off of the mammal. They get food, the mammal gets these ticks and little insects cleaned out of its fur. Other times they'll just kind of hitch a ride, and as insects are sort of exposed as the mammal walks around, the bird will hop off and grab them. You know, some of those other fish that follow along the sharks, okay, and they eat little bits of leftovers. Another example. These are acacia trees and ants, and the ants protect them from predators. We're gonna move along for now. Just got a couple last topics in this ecology section. So, when we think about various organisms, we often will talk about their niche. It's basically like everything about an organism, what it does, what it eats, when it's active, what type of ecosystem it lives in, all those sort of details, its geographic area, we call that species niche. For example, we talk about the niche of a squirrel. You might say, okay, it lives in forested areas in the northeast United States, it's active during the daytime, it harvests nuts and so forth, that's what its food source is, makes nests in trees. So all those little details about it would be its niche. Okay? Its habitat, where it lives, would be a part of that. So often you have many organisms within the same habitat, but usually you won't have multiple species with the exact same niche. Because what would happen when two species live in the same habitat and have the exact same niche?
Competition.
Yeah, they would compete. They'd compete for those resources. If you had another species that lived in the same area as the squirrel, ate the same foods, was active at the same times in the same geographic location, well, they'd both be trying to get the same resources. And if that resource is limited, there's going to be some competition. And in those situations, when you have competition between different species, usually one of the species is better adapted and wins out, and the other one dies off or has to change its niche in some way if possible so that it doesn't compete. Dan?
Like, do squirrels compete with other squirrels?
That would be called interspecies competition. But here we're talking about between different species. You know, an example of this is why anyone planted a garden recently? No? At your house? Or your parents did?
Oh, yeah, they're starting.
Do they make you go out and weed it ever?
So, yeah, it's horrible.
So when you weed your garden, you weed it because of this concept. Because the tomato plants you just put in your garden have the same niche as the weeds in our area. And so if you just never weeded the garden and allowed this competition to take place, what would happen?
No plants.
There would be lots of plants.
No food plants.
But probably these fast-growing weeds that might start growing in your garden would start to compete with your tomato plants. Compete with them for sunlight, for nutrients from the soil, and that competition would lead to less resources for your tomato plant, and probably would it grow as well or grow at all. So when you go out and weed your plants, you're reducing competition for the plants you want to grow. All right, so our last topic in this section is about succession. So this has to do with the question I asked you before class. What would happen if an ecosystem are left undisturbed? They don't stay basically the same, unchanging. You know, if you have this courtyard of our school, if the grounds crew stop mowing the lawn out there, okay, it's not going to just stay grass forever. That ecosystem is going to start to change. Grass is not the natural ecosystem in our area. And that process is called succession. It's when an ecosystem goes through gradual changes of one community replacing another until it reaches kind of a final stable ecosystem. If you imagine our courtyard and they stopped mowing the lawn out there. So this year, this summer, the grass would get much taller. Probably some weeds would start to grow in there. All right, if they again went on a whole another year and they didn't mow it ever, well then you start to get some larger plants, taller weeds. Another year, maybe you start to get some like woody vines, some like bushes might be starting to grow, maybe some small trees, the seeds land in there start to grow. And if they're not disturbed, they're going to continue. And if you continue sort of thinking about that for this process over 5, 10, 15 years, it's going to start to establish sort of a different type of ecosystem than you see today. Something like quick growing trees, bushes. And then if you continue letting that be undisturbed, some smaller, quick growing trees would start to grow in there. And they would eventually be replaced by slower growing, larger, faster trees. In our area of the northeast deciduous forest, basically just about any ecosystem that if you left it undisturbed would eventually turn into a beech, birch, maple forest usually. American beech trees, yellow birch, sugar maple. Those are our native, we call that our climax community. That's sort of the final stage. Think about undisturbed areas where you go, whether it's hiking somewhere, camping, or around your neighborhood, the areas where there's no houses. Probably it's woods. If it's not woods, it's been recently disturbed or maintained to be something else. Now, like we mentioned earlier, that's in our area. If you go north just a little ways or up in elevation, the climax community changes into sort of a spruce fir forest, okay, hemlock forest. Think about if you go hiking in the Adirondacks, if you go up to the high peaks, if you go farther north into Canada, you get different types of forests. If you go farther south, you end up with different ecosystems. When I was in Costa Rica, some parts of the country were a tropical rainforest ecosystem. Other parts were a tropical dry forest. At higher elevations, it was a cloud forest. If you go to the southeast United States, the climax community is a desert. If you go to the Midwest, it's a grassland. Okay, if you go to Africa, it depends where in Africa you are. It might be a savanna, it might be a desert. Varies from place to place. So different climatic conditions lead to different climax communities. Now, if we start, there's two types of succession, but let's start, if a farmer plowed his field, was going to plant corn, so all you have is bare soil, but then that farmer decided not to plant it, okay? That would be one type of succession. What would be the very first things that probably start growing there?
Yes.
Weeds, grasses, things like that. Quick growing, small herbaceous plants. But then gradually it would go through those changes. Now how about, for example, in Hawaii, what's happening on Kauai? Is it Kauai or is it Oahu?
It's the Big Island.
Oh, it is a big island. Are you sure?
Yeah.
Okay, on the big island of Hawaii, okay, is it Kilauea, the volcano?
Yeah.
Is now, it's one of the most active volcanoes in the world. It is molten rock, lava you might call it, is spilling out, okay? And that rock is solidifies pretty quickly and forms rock. There's nothing there but rock in those areas. Will that ever form an ecosystem?
Not for a long time.
Yeah, well.
Will that ever form an ecosystem?
Oh, yeah, it
Yeah.
will, yes.
Eventually. Even bare rock can develop into a forest. Okay? How does that do that? What can grow on bare rock?
Oh, certain plants grow on their
Water.
moss.
Moss and
So-
and like moss and like mushroom.
No, not quite, but it is a fungal relationship. So if you ever go hiking like somewhere where there's just rock, bedrock, like if you go up Bald Mountain or Black Bear Mountain or Blue Mountain, any of those mountains, at the top you just have like rock, right? But if you look closely at that rock, you'll see stuff like growing on it.
Oh, there's little cracks
What's in between?
There's lichen. It's like the scaly stuff. That can grow right on bare rock. Mosses can sometimes grow right on bare rock. And after those things start growing there as they die and decompose, what starts to build up?
Soil.
A tiny little thin layer of soil. Some plants only need the thinnest layer of soil to start to grow. But then as those plants grow, die, and decompose, the soil gradually builds up over time until you have a thicker layer of soil that can support larger trees. That can lead to a whole forest from just bare rock. So those first organisms that can start to colonize a new area, they're called the pioneer community. On bare rock, it's things like algae and lichens and moss. On soil, it might be grasses and fast-growing herbaceous plants. Just like the pioneers were like the first Europeans to move westward in North America. They were a pioneer community and ecosystem are the first things that can grow and take over. And eventually this leads to succession, which results in a climax, sort of the end stage of development. A stable community that doesn't really change in its species composition. Now it doesn't mean if you have a mature forest around here, it doesn't mean every tree is going to live forever. But in a climax community, when the trees die off, they're usually replaced with similar types of species. Here are just some diagrams to kind of show the stages of succession, primary succession, sort of in some areas. You go from, bare rock with lichens and mosses, grasses, herbs, shrubs, small trees, seedlings, some fast-growing tree species, and then eventually slower-growing trees that are the climax.
Aren't a lot of islands formed from like lava?
Some are, like all the Hawaiian Islands are all formed by volcanic activity. Yeah.
Oh, did you know that you can follow, like, if you want to Google Maps and you go to the islands, you can see, like, where the plates have shifted and stuff, because there's, like, tiny mountains under the water.
Yeah,
The plates-
and like there's hot spots there. So as the plates are moving, the hot spots create this flow and form islands, but then as the plates move, then an island forms above that same hot spot. Yeah.
Wouldn't the rock, like, if something was underneath it, preserve it?
It could be like,
Because they just found, like, the guy from Pompeii, and he was, like, perfectly preserved.
yeah, it depends on the conditions and how they were settled. Like a lot of times lava will just burn up everything. But if they're like covered in like dust or stuff like that, then that can get preserved. Also another thing, ponds are a good example. So if you ever know anybody or have a pond like on a property or been somewhere where there's just a pond, you may know that if people want to continue to have a pond there, they have to maintain it. Because typically a pond like this will slowly over time become shallower and shallower and eventually completely fill in. Because in the pond, as things sort of die, as the vegetation dies off, sinks to the bottom and decomposes, the bottom starts to sort of build up with this sediment and eventually fills in. It can actually eventually form a forest ecosystem. Now, people that have a pond and want to keep it around, they might dig it out every 5 years or something, or dredge it, basically suck out the sediment. Yeah.
What if it's like fishing?
What-
What if fishing?
The fish might eventually die.
What about like lakes? Does that happen to a lake?
Not generally, because the lakes have a flow of water into them to establish them. Ponds usually do not. Ponds are usually like man-made. So the primary succession is the name for the succession that starts on bare rock, where there's no soil previously. Secondary succession usually happens when there is soil. So it follows some sort of disturbance. Sometimes they're natural disturbances, like a flooding, mudslide, forest fire. Other times they're man-made disturbances, bulldozing an ecosystem, a farmer plowing a field. And here in this picture, we can sort of see the stages. This is a forest that was affected by a forest fire. Basically destroyed the vast majority of the vegetation on the forest floor. And then 1 year later, we have succession beginning, where you have new plants starting to grow and so forth. Some ecosystems are even adapted to fire, in that there are some species of pine trees where the cones have a resin that makes them closed up, and they won't open up and release their seeds until they're exposed to fire. And so some ecosystems actually require fire in order to reproduce. There's one in Albany, the Albany pine bush is one where fire is a natural part of the ecosystem. And sometimes when you're sort of driving through in the summertime, you may see a lot of smoke coming from that area along the thruway. Sometimes they do prescribed burns where they actually set the understory on fire so that it can sort of replenish itself and go through its natural system.
We learned about that last year. You had to like argue your point.
Oh, about
Forest fires.
Yeah.
oh, you did that firestorm?
Yeah, we described it.
We made up like a town.
Yeah, it's a pretty interesting. Kids always told me they did that for a long time, and like, yeah.